To crosstalk the rise of the right, I'm joined by my guest, Sunny Hundal in London. He is a journalist and writer for The Guardian and Al Jazeera. In Berlin, we have Harold Wielenbach. He is a researcher and a member of the European Radicalization Awareness Network. And in Harrisburg, we cross to Paul Gottfried. He is an author and professor emeritus at Elizabethtown College. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Sunny, if I can go to you first, I think my introduction should be a little familiar to you because I stole it, okay, from an article that you wrote recently, and I want to quote one of the sentences. I'm talking about the right-wing groups and parties in the West. They put on smart suits, stop using crude racist language, and set out to gain respectability. Explain to our viewers what you mean.
Well, I think that a lot of the parties across Western Europe, especially in the UK, in France, in Germany, Austria, and especially in the Netherlands, what they've tried to do is realize that a lot of the language that they used in the past, which was sometimes very anti-Semitic, very racist, they've realized that times have changed and people have changed their views on those issues, and so they can't actually get respectability using that language and using those phrases. So what they've tried to do is try to become and focus their arguments and make them much more about Muslims. They've tried to make their arguments much more about just immigrants generally, and you played on existing worries that people have to gain more respectability and to get more political power across Western Europe.
Harold, what do you think about that? Because if you look at like the National Front, let's say in France, you don't hear any more homophobic remarks coming out. They like the state of Israel. They've changed quite a bit, and they've changed with the electorate, but they still have very strong nationalist, and some people would say still ultra-nationalist views. So are they a right wing in a nicer suit? I mean, the message sounds a lot more pleasant, but at the core, it's still the same.
Well, yes, indeed. I think there was quite some professionalism with right-wing groups, and also their attempt to clearly appeal to the general audience and to the populace in general, which for us as practitioners of prevention programs and as policymakers means that we have to find new answers and responses to this mainstreaming of extremist thought.
Okay, but Harold, how do you do that if the message it seems more attractive and it doesn't seem so violent and crude like it used to be? We can think of the English Defence League. I mean, when you watch them in crowds, it was actually just it was vulgar. And now they decided, no way, we're not going to do that anymore. We'll use social networks. We'll be on Twitter, and their appeal is stronger. But the message is very same. But it's a form. And how do you deal with dealing with a new format that is more pleasant, or has someone put it, kinder and gentler?
Absolutely, Peter. You have to be much more smart and systematic. And let me point to what the European Commission does, actually. It has inaugurated in 2011 the Radicalization Awareness Network. That is a network close to the EU Commission that is designed to actually find the answers to these more intricate problems. And if you look at what they do, and I'm happy actually to work with them voluntarily, they differentiate the whole problem of extremism, radicalization into different sections. So there's a section dealing with media and internet. There's also a section dealing with prisons and probation, addressing practitioners that work there and whose job it is actually to help young people that are offended and racist and extremists to actually disengage. There's another section that tries to find intelligent answers for school teachers.
Well, I mean, okay, but how do we deal, if I could go to Harrisburg, if I can go to Paul here, I mean, what is the appeal of the right? And the right is growing in Europe, and we've all agreed so far on this program that they're striving for respectability. But why is there the hard economic times, the frustration with the European Union, or, and I want to talk about a little bit later, the frustration with the establishment? Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I think the major problem here, and I disagree profoundly with the other two speakers on this program, the major problem, it seems to me, is that European and American politics have swung radically toward the left since the 1960s. what has been described perhaps pejoratively, but nonetheless accurately, as a cultural Marxist agenda. Gay rights, multiculturalism, feminism, things that I, as somebody at the age of 72, could not even have imagined around 1960. The people who are opposing this are not the old classe collaboratrice in France. They're not supporters of the Vichy government. They're not German Nazis, God knows. The people who oppose it are decent, middle-class Christian people who are sick of being brainwashed by the left. I've written numerous books on this, which have been published by leading presses.
Okay, all right.
Go ahead.
This is Crosstalk. Sonny, please jump in. This is why we all have you on the program. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think this is absolute rubbish, to be honest, to be blunt. For example, in the UK, the English Defence League are very pro-gay rights. They're very much about pro-women's rights over here, or so they claim to be. And also they say that they are trying to protect Britain from the conservative forces of Sharia law and from Muslims, who are actually generally quite conservative, culturally conservative. You know, so in the UK, especially in France, for example, again, Marine Le Pen has been against immigrants, but actually been saying that, you know, she wants to protect gay rights in France, and for example, in the Netherlands. You know, they've been very strong about how immigrants and Muslims, you know, the far right has been that they don't integrate with our way of life, which is about tolerance and free speech and gay rights and women's rights. And so actually this idea that these people have risen as a response to so-called cultural Marxism is completely wrong. It's to completely misunderstand what's going on in Europe. And I think the problem is more that they feel economic insecurity, people across Europe, partly because of increased immigration, globalization, and you know, as you said, also actually there is some disenchantment with the political establishment, and because of that, that's coming out in the form of you know, support for smaller parties which are quite anti-establishment, quite
Yeah, but it's very interesting because we've all agreed on one thing here so far. Harold, if I can go back to you in Berlin, I mean, is this just to get elected now? This is kind of interesting because a lot of these right-wing groups are changing their agenda, and we've mentioned it. We've talked about immigration and the Muslim issue, and this is electability. Is this the platform to get into power, then to reveal themselves?
Well, let me comment on what has been said, actually, from the perspective of those who actually do work with the problem on the ground level. And that means people like I mentioned already, teachers, social workers, de-radicalization practitioners that actually have to deal with the hard end of the issue. And if you ask them, this is what the RAN network in Brussels actually does, it goes out and talks to practitioners, assuming that they, social practitioners, therapists, that they know most about the issue and what to do. What they come back to you, and the recommendation is the following: we all must depoliticize the issue. So for that reason, depoliticize the issue of violent extremism, because it is about hatred against groups, and it is about emotions and hatred against particular groups of people. Now, if you listen to that, you'd be surprised, because you'd think that extremism is all about politics or religion. Well, in fact, if you are a first-line practitioner working with the offenders and with all the context, you realize it isn't. It is about young, mostly young, very angry people that you need to talk to in a certain way to help them to get out of there. So I would, especially in academia, support anybody
okay, you mentioned academia. That's fair enough. But if I can go to Paul, I mean, Paul, I can see where you're coming from, because it seems to me that the political establishment and Hollywood, to throw them in there, they set the agenda of what society should be about, okay? And I think this is what's disturbed a lot of people. Go ahead. I just want to broaden this out. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, there's several points I want to make in response to this. First of all, the angriest, most hateful group that I've met are the re-educators, the people who cannot stand traditional society, wish to impose multiculturalism on them, and have exacerbated economic problems by bringing in groups of people who live off public welfare disproportionately. Points that have been made by Sarrazin, in Deutschland schafft sich ab, and other books which examine very, very closely the economic consequences of the kind of third world immigration that is occurring. Another point is I readily concede that parties of the right are now appealing to gays, feminists, and other groups whom they would not have touched years ago. The reason is obvious. The political electorate has moved decidedly to the left because of the educational establishment, Hollywood, and the political class generally. The result of this is that right-wing parties have to appeal to people who on cultural issues are well to the left of where most people, including communists, used to stand. And they are doing this in order to create some kind of electorate to avert a greater catastrophe, which they think will come by having their country thoroughly submerged by third world immigration. This is not because they are opportunistic. It is because they see they have no other choice in the matter. Therefore, they try to get all, let's say, Dutch-speaking people, including gays, to support them against the immigration.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the rise of the right. Staying with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the rise of right-wing movements. Okay, gentlemen, let's continue our spirited debate there. Sonny, you were listening to what Paul had to say before we went to the break. You want to reply to him? Go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to take issue with some of the points that Paul made. I mean, firstly, for example, I've spent some time hanging out with people from the English Defence League, and one of the things that always struck me was actually that how comfortable they were in criticizing not the left, but actually conservative Muslims. And so their point wasn't about immigration. And actually what's interesting is that the English Defence League don't take a strong position on immigration. Their issue, and that's the BNP which has taken an issue with immigration, the English Defence League's issue has always been the imposition of Sharia law. That's been their biggest problem, or so they claim anyway. And actually the imposition of culturally conservative values, as opposed to, trying to reach out to, conservatives, like as Paul seems to be implying. A lot of the far-right parties in Austria, in the Netherlands, some in France, as well as in the UK, are actually quite mixed in terms of racially too, especially in France. There's a lot of black people who support the National Front. In the UK, there's some black people I've seen who support the National Front, but also they claim themselves that they're actually not racist at all. They claim that they don't have a problem with black people coming even into the UK. I mean, what I'm trying to say is actually it's a very mixed picture, and the way that Paul from Harrisburg is trying to, generalize is actually not really helpful. And there's a broader point here actually, which is that it's less to do with so-called third world immigration, because a lot of the immigration into the UK has been from Eastern Europe. Yeah. It's not been from the so-called third world. And actually, especially in the UK, the big rise in immigration of the last 5 to 10 years has been from Eastern Europe. And so they are more worried about not only, and these people are white mostly. So, the sort of the racist tropes that are being thrown at me are actually not only silly, but also, kind of just wrong. The problem that they have is with immigration and the lack of the living standards falling, and the fact that their world is changing very fast. They don't really know how to adjust to it, and they feel angry about the way that Britain is going. Those are very complicated issues, and it's silly to just bring them down to third world immigration.
Okay, Harold, let's kind of broaden this out again. I mean, social injustice drives a lot of this as well. And we can look from the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 to the present. You know, I mean, on both sides of the Atlantic, the bankers were taken care of, the establishment was taken care of, but a lot of people have fallen through the cracks. And I think this is another thing that politicizes people. Yeah. In what direction or the other is another question here, but it has politicized people because the West is becoming a society of haves and have-nots, and in a very extreme way. Harold in Berlin, please go ahead.
Yes, I would fully support you on that, and I also support Sunny. I think George's position strikes me as somewhat ideologically and sort of off the realities. It doesn't reflect anything that I can perceive in Europe as being the case or as being one of the resources of extremism, whatever sort. I think whenever ideology comes in, we need a dose of research and publication. And the RAN network in Brussels, then the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, when its publication on right-wing extremism in Europe gives you reasons and solutions. And Peter, I would support you too. Certainly the economic crisis is one factor. On the other hand, there's always been a solid proportion of up to 20% within German population that would hold strongly anti-democratic views, including anti-human rights, anti-fundamental rights views against foreigners, gays, lesbians, and all the typical target groups. So on the one hand, it is an economic crisis that has its effects. On the other hand, there's some social psychology that has always been there.
Paul, again, I'm an American as well. I'm an American as well, and and I have to say that there's some elements that I do agree with you, because there is this cultural hegemony right now, and it's very, very it really crowds out a lot of discussions. Not that we should agree to racism or any kind of abuse to minorities, but it seems that everything's been said and decided, and you have to believe a certain way. And I feel that way that has happened in the United States over the last few decades.
Yeah, let me raise 2 points. First of all, we are trapped in a vocabulary that is created by the cultural Marxist left, like extreme right-wing. There are no extreme left-wing. The left has been running the show in terms of molding culture, education for decades and decades throughout the Western world. We have no left-wing extremists. People who disagree with us are against human rights. We define what human rights mean. 25 years ago in the United States, people looked askance at gay anything. Many states criminalized homosexuality. Now we attack Putin as being anti-human rights and anti-democratic, which he may in fact be a thug. I'm not even going to speak to this issue.
Certainly is not the case on this
because he does not support gay rights.
Well, he's not against.
Right.
He's not against gay rights. This is one of the myths that the media always is propagating right now. It may have laws that others don't like, right, but that's not the case here. Sonny, can you speak to that? Because
right, I totally agree with you about
okay,
Putin.
no problem about that. Sonny, I mean, let me go to Sonny here. You want to finish up? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, no, what I wanted to say is that the left determines the vocabulary and what is the content of human rights. And then in the case of Putin, they selectively target people whom they don't like as right-wing extremists or homophobes. What happens is the energy field is entirely with the left. Now, the gentleman from The Guardian, I think, made a valid point that the thing that right-wing parties, and I will not use right-wing extreme parties, but parties of the right, what they object to will very often be a mixed bag, and it will depend upon the region in which you find them. Obviously, in England, there has been a larger number of Eastern Europeans than third world people who are coming in, and there is some grumbling about that. In Germany, on the other hand, most of the new immigration seems to be from Africa, the Middle East, and it is no longer Eastern European. But I think that in all of these areas where you have the rise of what is called the new right, there is dissatisfaction with left-wing hegemony. My friend in Berlin does not seem to be aware of how widespread this hegemony is. And having spent the last 40 years in an academic lunatic asylum, I assure you that it is total in many quarters of American life.
Okay, I was in academia for a while. I found it to be a straitjacketed as well at times. Sonny, go ahead, jump in London.
Yeah, I mean, I think spending time in that lunatic asylum has kind of affected his, thinking a little bit. The point is that in the UK and actually across Europe, values have changed, cultural values have changed more broadly to become much more tolerant, much more open, much more liberal, and even in the United States. So people are much more accepting of gay rights, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, just because he doesn't like it doesn't necessarily mean that that the left has sort of done some sort of a takeover. In fact, on economic terms, it's the right which has won out. We've become a much more unequal society. The bankers, as you pointed out, have become, much more powerful. They've managed to get away with, holding on to power and respect and being bailed out despite the 2008 crash, even as lots of other people have fallen through the cracks. So actually what's happened is that even while our societies have become much more open, liberal, tolerant, and even more accepting of immigration, in the UK there is far more acceptance of immigration that's ever been, and that's across Europe too. The problem is that people feel that the pace of change, especially economic change, is affecting their livelihoods. And that's a lot to do with the way our economic systems are and the way that the bankers have pretty much made sure that the society remains unequal, and the financial elites have made sure that carries on. So to try and blame cultural Marxism is just, it's so redundant, it's so 1960s, I can't even begin to start on it, because the world has moved on, basically. The problems that we face now are much more to do with growing inequality, instabilization, people feeling that their livelihoods are not secure, and as a result, especially a lot of the youth in Western Europe are turning towards extreme groups because they feel like those are the only people articulating their concerns.
Okay, we're fastly running out of time. Let me go to Harold in Berlin, because I think Sonny is really onto something here, because you have an economy that is crueler and meaner than ever before, ever since the end of the Second World War, and then you have a different cultural set. I mean, this is the disconnect here, I think, that a lot of people are feeling. Again, it seems to me, left or right, traditional left or right in Europe, it's a plague on both their houses, because they're the establishment. You just move a little bit to one degree or the other, but they still have power here. And I think this is frustrating for a lot of people, because a lot of people did fall through the cracks over the last decade.
Absolutely. As I did before, I can support that. I was just chuckling a little bit to myself. When you're watching us three, getting polarized, they certainly told me that we are probably not much of a solution or help in this, because we sort of radicalize this, and we might find that enlivening. I could certainly sort of drag on with the debate and and ask where the Marxist left-wing powers are in Europe. I don't see them, but I think we shouldn't engage in that any further. I very much actually. In the intro, I should have said more clearly, I am an academic, yes, but first of all, I am a therapist and I'm a practitioner. So for me, it's more interesting to actually do more research about and talk more about what we actually do. As interesting as the question might be, where it actually comes from, the problem with extremism, right-wing extremism. So what should practitioners, teachers, social workers actually do? Media workers, what kind of journalism do we need? What kind of debate do we need, so that we can actually support,
gentlemen, we've run out of time, and we did have a debate on this program. Many thanks to my guests in London, Berlin, and in Harrisburg. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.